treks happening. So welcome everyone to the American Irish Historical Society and the Irish American Heritage Museum. We're delighted to have with us Professor Ian Delahanty from Springfield University, who teaches American history, including courses on immigration history, public history, African American history, and the history of the Civil War era. His first book, of course, is the one we're going to be talking about tonight, Embracing Emancipation. And it deals with, it's a transatlantic history of Irish American slavery and the American Union. And he looks at the multifaceted roles played by Irish Americans, both in perpetuating slavery and fighting for emancipation. And while we were offline, we were just talking about how much more notice the kind of negative aspect, and certainly the draft rights in New York gets than some of the other elements of this. So the book is going to be very interesting. Your next research, we'll talk about that soon, maybe examines the role of the New England cotton gin manufacturers in the global cotton economy of the 19th century. I just want to remind everyone on Zoom that we have the chat or the Q&A features down here at the bottom of your screen. So if you're interested in asking a question, do please type it in. We'll probably let Dr. Delahanty, do his presentation all the way through, and then I'll filter the questions at the end. But if something comes to you while you're listening, then absolutely type it, and I'll moderate the questions at the end. So thank you very much, Dr. Delahanty, and welcome, and we're looking forward to your talk.
First of all, thanks very much, Elizabeth, for the invitation to speak with you all, and for those in attendance, thank you all for your time tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got just a few images that kind of accompany the story I'll tell here. And of course, wanted to highlight the book, Embracing Emancipation, A Transatlantic History of Irish American Slavery in the American Union, 1840 to 1865, published by Fordham University Press and just released about a month or two ago now. So what I thought I'd do tonight is use my time. I'm going to aim for roughly 35 minutes or so to provide a synopsis of the book's main arguments, and then go in a little bit more depth of discussion about its earlier chapters. And to do that, I'd like to start us here at the New York Academy of Music on an early April night in 1863. And this is, in fact, from the latter part of the book, actually, right around the time of the draft riots that Liz just mentioned. And it was almost exactly 2 years since the start of the Civil War. And only 4 months earlier, President Abraham Lincoln's signature to the Emancipation Proclamation had linked the restoration of the American Union to the liberation of enslaved African Americans. And of course, only 3 months later in July, mobs of mostly, but not entirely, Irish-born laborers would take to the streets of New York in violent opposition to conscription, to the Union war effort generally, and in part to Black freedom. But on this early April night in 1863, some 7,000 New Yorkers, the vast majority of whom were Irish-born by all accounts, they gathered at the Academy of Music without regard for their views in the Union war effort or with respect to emancipation. And the crowd included anti-war peace Democrats and steely Union veterans who momentarily set aside their differences over the war. It crossed lines of class between genteel second-generation Irish Americans and Irish-born wage workers. Even native-born Protestant New Yorkers, many of whom harbored deep suspicions about the city's Irish-born population, they cheered the speeches of militant Irish nationalists who whipped the audience into a frenzy with talk of liberating the island from which they had been exiled. And what brought this crowd together at the Academy of Music was the prospect of famine in Ireland. Only a decade and a half earlier, Irish and native-born Americans had responded to the Great Irish Potato Famine by raising millions of dollars in famine relief funds. And now, with Irish and Irish American newspapers reporting on what seemed to be an impending food shortage in Ireland, Irish Americans set aside their differences over the Union war effort to raise famine relief funds. And as I read through the many speeches delivered on this occasion, the line that stood out to me came from the man we see here, Richard O'Gorman. O'Gorman was an exiled young Ireland rebel from the rebellion of 1848, who now lived the comfortable life of a New York City attorney in between delivering blistering attacks on the Lincoln administration. And the quote I've pulled out from O'Gorman's speech here is how he sort of framed and interpreted the provision of famine relief to Ireland from the United States. He told the crowd, quote, "The union between Ireland and America increases day by day. There is not a ship that crosses the ocean from an Irish to an American port, but is as the shuttle weaving in closer and firmer the destinies of these two nations now and forever united. And I wanted to start with this anecdote because my book really explores how what O'Gorman calls this union between Ireland and America entangled Irish people on both sides of the Atlantic into a debate over the future of American slavery. Between 1840 and 1865, some 2 million Irish immigrated to the United States, and over that same span, Americans and Irish Americans sent millions of dollars to Ireland in the form of famine relief, in the form of donations to Irish nationalist organizations, and especially in the form of immigrant remittances to family and friends. Irish American newspapers in this period reported on crop yields, ship departures, and nationalist politics in Ireland. Meanwhile, Irish newspapers debated the causes and eventually the course of the American Civil War. And in this kind of constellation of nodes between Ireland and the United States in the Civil War era, the question of slavery's future in America cropped up incessantly. Abolitionists in Ireland and America lobbied prospective immigrants, as well as Irish Americans, to join the anti-slavery movement. Irish nationalists argued over whether or not to accept donations from enslavers and their allies in the United States. And most of all, Irish Americans considered how the debate over slavery's expansion would affect not only their prospects as immigrants in America, but also the potential for their adopted country to contribute to the economic and political welfare of their native land. And so in the book, I followed this debate and eventually the conflict over the future of American slavery from the perspective of Irish people on both sides of the Atlantic. And what I tried to do is trace how what O'Gorman called this union between Ireland and America influenced Irish Americans' involvement in the contest over slavery's expansion. And I think that maybe begs a question, which is of what significance was Irish Americans' involvement in that contest? To William Lloyd Garrison, who you see on the screen here, one of, if not the most influential abolitionists in the Civil War era, the answer to that question was clear. Garrison wrote in an 1849 letter that Irish immigrants held, quote, the key of the slave's dungeon, as the balance of political power is in their hands. And Garrison was just one of dozens of abolitionists who either visited Ireland to drum up support for the anti-slavery movement or lobbied the Irish in America to join the abolitionist cause. But by the time of the Civil War in 1861, abolitionists like Garrison were miffed that Irish immigrants who claimed to have been oppressed in Ireland had seemingly taken the side of enslavers and their allies in the United States. In fact, that same kind of paradox has been one of the more enduring problems for historians of the Civil War era and historians of the Irish in America alike to try to kind of figure out. And to explain it, scholars on this subject have pointed to, first, working class Irish immigrants' fears of labor competition from newly freed slaves. Second, to the influence of an American Catholic hierarchy that opposed virtually all forms of social reform in this period, especially abolitionism. And third, to the influence of a pro-slavery Democratic Party that offered a welcoming embrace to Irish immigrants in this mid-19th century period. More recently, a fourth explanation posited by so-called whiteness scholarship has argued that Irish immigrants supported slavery and adopted anti-Black racism in order to prove their white racial identity to a skeptical native-born populace. Now, what I found to be the common thread in these various explanations of Irish American opposition to anti-slavery is an emphasis almost exclusively on circumstances in the United States, be they economic, religious, political, or social. But to bring us back to Richard O'Gorman's line, it was this union between Ireland and America that conditioned much of Irish American life in the mid-19th century. And so in Embracing Emancipation, I try to offer a new explanation for Irish Americans' involvement in the debate over the future of American slavery. And I want to just briefly outline the two interrelated arguments that I make in the book. The first main argument I advance is that Irish Americans' involvement in this contest over the future of slavery in America was, I think, influenced decisively by their backgrounds in and their sort of continuously renewed connections with Ireland. So in other words, Irish immigrants' experiences in their native land, as well as kind of a web of social, economic, and political ties between Ireland and the United States, these collectively molded Irish Americans' ideas on and views about Black slavery and its connection to their adopted homeland. Now, the second main argument in Embracing Emancipation is that many if not most, Irish Americans' views on slavery and its relationship to America, in fact, changed during the Civil War. As I alluded to previously, contemporary abolitionists and academic historians alike have sort of struggled to explain the seeming unanimity and endurance of Irish immigrants' opposition to the anti-slavery movement. But in the book, I present evidence that a critical mass of Irish Americans actually embraced emancipation during the Civil War. And I think just as importantly, I stress that they did so as a result of the same transatlantic forces that had led them to oppose virtually all forms of anti-slavery during the antebellum period. So those are the two main arguments that I kind of stake out in the book. And rather than attempt to give a distillation of the book in its entirety for the rest of my time with you all, I'm going to try to expand a bit more upon the first of those two arguments that I just outlined. And I want to do this because I think it'll help to establish the sort of transatlantic lens through which Irish Americans approached the debate over slavery's future in America. And in fact, I argue in the book that Irish American views on slavery and abolitionism, especially during both the antebellum and Civil War periods, that these had essential origins in what I've termed in the book the Irish critique of abolitionism. I want to kind of just briefly unpack that term before kind of going into a bit more of a narrative here. So the Irish critique of abolitionism developed in famine-era Ireland and was really first articulated by a faction of Irish nationalists dubbed the Young Ireland movement. Its proponents regarded abolitionism as a sort of divisive distraction within Irish nationalist politics, as well as a design of what they viewed as kind of Anglophilic reformers who cared more about the suffering of African-American slaves than about the needs and the welfare of Irish people. And in the longer story that I tell in the book, the Irish critique of abolitionism crossed the Atlantic during the famine and then became the basis of Irish American opposition to anti-slavery writ large during the sectional crisis over slavery. But for now, what I want to do is dwell a bit more on how this originated in Ireland between about 1840 and kind of building to a crescendo in 1847. So the Irish critique of abolitionism arose in response to what was a two-pronged strategy on the part of abolitionist reformers in Ireland and America. Now, the first part of that strategy was to link the cause of Irish nationalism to the cause of Black freedom. And by this point in time, the Irish nationalist cause itself was embodied by the man whose portrait you see on the screen here, Daniel O'Connell. The second part of the strategy was to recruit prospective Irish immigrants, those who had yet to leave Ireland, to recruit them into the anti-slavery movement before they departed for the United States. So I'll go into a bit of detail about each of these strategies before explaining how, in my view, they ultimately backfired as the famine onset during the mid-1840s. So the book starts in 1840 with the coalescence of really two movements. And in that year, in 1840, the Irish MP and nationalist leader Daniel O'Connell established in Dublin the Loyal National Repeal Association. The aim of the Repeal Association, or the LNRA, as I'll kind of call it for an abbreviation, its aim was to annul or to repeal the 1801 Act of Union between Ireland, that abolished the Irish Parliament, and thereby created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The repeal movement was at first slow to gain traction, but by 1843, it had become a genuinely mass political movement across Ireland, not just in Dublin, but across the Irish countryside. Hundreds of thousands of Irish people contributed to the Repeal Association via a penny per month, quote unquote, rent that they paid to the Repeal Association's headquarters in Dublin. Many Irish could read or have read to them the minutes of the association's meetings that were published, and they did so through one of the many Irish newspapers whose editors threw their support behind the repeal campaign. All right, so this is happening between 1840, 1843, or 44 or so. It's kind of gaining traction across the island. Now, on a smaller, but I think no less dynamic scale, the first third of the 1840s in Ireland also witnessed the growth of an abolitionist movement centered in Dublin. The Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society had formed initially in 1837 around the leadership of the three men that I put on the screen here. From left to right, you have Richard Davis Webb. He's a Quaker printer, Richard Allen, who's a Quaker draper, and James Houghton, who's a Unitarian corn merchant, all three of them Dubliners, all three of them kind of comprising the core of the abolitionist movement in Ireland. In 1840, these three men, as well as other members of the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society, I'll call it HAS for shorthand, they traveled to London where they attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention. In the group portrait of that meeting that I have on the screen here, you can see Daniel O'Connell featured prominently on stage behind the speaker, Thomas Clarkson, but also on the audience is a kind of miniature portrait of the society's co-founder, Richard Allen. And while they were in London for this convention, they met for the first time and really became enamored with the Boston-based abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. And from that point forward, Garrison's emphasis on moral suasion tactics and his calls for immediate and unconditional abolition, this really guided the Haas members' involvement in the transatlantic anti-slavery movement. So I think this, begs another question, which is how could Irish abolitionists affect moral suasion tactics across an ocean? Garrison and American abolitionists could do this through their newspapers, through anti-slavery speeches that they delivered across the country. How can Irish abolitionists persuade Americans or affect the slavery debate in America across the Atlantic? And the answer they came to think was through O'Connell's repeal campaign. In the 1830s, O'Connell had played a key part in Parliament's abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Of course, we just saw him in this 1840 portrayal of the Anti-Slavery Convention in London. And now his leadership of the Repeal Association gave him this unrivaled influence over the Irish masses. Additionally, the repeal movement had broad support in the United States among both Irish immigrants, as well as many native-born Americans. And so to Irish abolitionists and their colleagues in the United States, this all held out the sort of tantalizing possibility that O'Connell's influence could be used to recruit both prospective Irish immigrants in Ireland and the Irish already in America into the anti-slavery movement. And indeed, O'Connell didn't hesitate to use this kind of figurative megaphone that he had as Repeal's leader to denounce American enslavers and their enablers, and to lobby Irish people on both sides of the Atlantic to join the abolitionist cause. And I want to just give a couple examples that I highlight in the book to illustrate this kind of broader pattern. In a May 1843 speech to the Repeal Association at Dublin's Corn Exchange, you see this illustrated on the left-hand side of the screen here, O'Connell questioned how any Irish person could defend the practice of slavery as it existed in America. He said, quote, "The man who will do so belongs not to my kind." And just 2 years later, at another Repeal Association meeting in Dublin, he recounted to the body's membership his role in securing the abolition of slavery in the British Empire while he was a member of Parliament. And he described his motives at that time as follows. He said, quote, "The Irish people sent me to Parliament to carry out their principles. Their principles are abhorrent of slavery." And these are just two of many instances in the 1840s where O'Connell used the repeal platform to argue that Irish people bore an inherent dislike of oppression, including and especially perhaps the oppression of African-American slaves. And that rhetoric reached potentially millions of Irish listeners and readers who could hear it at a repeal meeting, who could read it in nationalist newspapers like The Nation, which you see here, or have it read to them in one of the hundreds of repeal reading rooms that had been set up across the island. And of course, it could also reach some of the millions of Irish immigrants and Irish Americans who followed closely the contours of the repeal movement in Ireland across the Atlantic. Now, at the same time, Irish abolitionists worked assiduously to cultivate anti-slavery sentiment among the Irish masses. And one of the more sort of intriguing discoveries I made in researching the book was that James Houghton, who I mentioned previously as a co-founder of the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society, Houghton was privately writing to O'Connell to lobby him to continue to link the cause of Irish freedom to the abolition of American slavery. And so he's doing this frequently throughout the early 1840s in private correspondence with O'Connell. Meanwhile, his abolitionist colleagues in Dublin, Limerick, Cork, and Belfast were kind of organizing more at the grassroots. They hosted anti-slavery lectures, including lectures delivered by formerly enslaved people. They solicited donations to anti-slavery fundraising efforts in the United States, and they made a special effort to gather donations of both money and also kind of material items from ordinary Irish men and women. And they even offered advice on how to replace slave-grown crops like tobacco and cotton to Irish people. In fact, the Hibernian reformers thought they could contribute to the anti-slavery cause best by recruiting into the movement prospective immigrants in Ireland. As early as 1840, the Society's co-founder, Richard Allen, wrote the letter that you see here to the Boston abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. And he stated in the letter that, quote, that Irish abolitionists would, quote, send out our emigrant countrymen sound on the great principle of man's universal charter to liberty. If you read the kind of prelude to that part of the quote, he's basically saying, look, we can't do much, but here's what we can do to contribute to the anti-slavery cause from Ireland. 6 years later, as emigration from Ireland increased rapidly during the famine, the Belfast Ladies Anti-Slavery Society wrote that, quote, if the sons and daughters of Erin were intellectually prepared to sympathize with the enslaved and injured colored inhabitants of America, what a difference might the immigrants who are continually leaving our shores carry with them. So again, there's this belief among the Irish abolitionists that they could contribute to the anti-slavery cause by sending over immigrants who would be kind of primed to take up the anti-slavery agenda. By 1851, the Haas Society's leaders even authored a pamphlet, that you see on the right-hand side of the screen here. The pamphlet was fittingly titled "Two Irish Immigrants Who Are Going to Depart for the United States of America," and it laid out in 4 crisp pages the moral and economic evils of slavery by emphasizing its unchristian nature and its damaging effects on the wages and employment of white workers. This pamphlet was distributed at points of departure and shipping agents' offices in Limerick, Cork, and Dublin. And we have to recall, of course, that at this point in time, you have hundreds of thousands of Irish passing through those cities and through shipping agents' offices in them as the famine emigration is kind of hitting a peak in the early 1850s. So one of the biggest questions I had when researching for the book was just how effective this all was, right? How effective, especially this effort to generate support for abolitionism among prospective immigrants was. To what extent would Irish people have had some engagement with anti-slavery discourse or rhetoric prior to or during the famine? And there's no way to simply measure with any sort of accuracy the number of Irish who read or heard anti-slavery speeches, who heard O'Connell speak, who saw one of the abolitionist lectures in Ireland at this time. But just given the massive support for O'Connell's repeal campaign, as well as what I think is the kind of sophistication of Irish abolitionist efforts to reach prospective immigrants, I feel confident that hundreds of thousands of Irish people were somewhat aware at some level of the abolitionist movement and had sort of, engaged with its message to varying degrees. And so I think this made it all the more important to determine why ultimately those efforts seem to have failed, because of course we know that the Irish in antebellum America were, virtually unanimously opposed to abolitionism and were more broadly opposed to political anti-slavery as well. And so this brings me back then to the Irish critique of abolitionism. By 1844, a faction of the repeal movement that called itself Young Ireland had started to question the efficacy of O'Connell's anti-slavery rhetoric. And among many other points of disagreement they had with O'Connell was his insistence on bringing the anti-slavery agenda into the repeal movement. They did this in the pages of The Nation, a Dublin weekly edited by the trio of men you see in the kind of apocryphal illustration on the screen here that portrays them conceiving of this newspaper while strolling through Phoenix Park one day in 1840. In The Nation, which soon became the most widely read newspaper in Ireland in the early to mid 1840s, the trio of editors started to question O'Connell's pursuit of abolitionism within the repeal movement. And it was a January 13th, 1844 editorial that signaled the start of a really years-long campaign by Young Ireland to try to mute any discussion of American slavery within nationalist politics. After O'Connell had once again threatened to return donations to the repeal movement with evident ties to American enslavers or their allies in America, the Nation's editors responded as follows. They said, quote, "Repeal must not be put into conflict with any party in the United States." Now, I think Young Irelanders' trepidation over O'Connell's anti-slavery rhetoric had both economic and political bases. The United States was at this point in time a vital source of financial support for the repeal movement. Just between July and August of 1843, for instance, American donations to the LNRA, they more than doubled those from every county in Ireland except County Wexford. And O'Connell's relentless criticisms of not only enslavers in America, but also anyone who seemingly didn't join the abolitionist movement. In the minds of young Irelanders, this threatened to kind of sap a crucial sort of support for the repeal campaign. In 1845, those financial considerations intermingled with a larger geopolitical problem. The United States and Britain were now on the precipice of war over a disputed boundary between the Oregon Territory and British Canada, as well as the prospect of American annexation of Texas. And amid the saber rattling that was going on in the halls of Parliament and in Congress, O'Connell spied an opportunity. He pledged in a speech Irish support for Britain in a prospective war with the United States if Parliament agreed to restore a domestic Irish Parliament back to Dublin. And I think really importantly, O'Connell justified this pledge of Irish loyalty or fealty to the British Empire in part by asserting correctly that American annexation of Texas would vastly expand the footprint of African American slavery. And for many young Irelanders, I think this was a sort of breaking point. In private, the Nation's co-editor John Blake Dillon confided to a colleague that, quote, everybody is indignant at O'Connell meddling in the business. His talk about bringing down the pride of the American eagle if England would pay us sufficiently is not merely foolish, but base and false. More publicly in the Nation, young Islanders proclaimed that, quote, notwithstanding the slavery of the Negro, the United States is liberty's bulwark and Ireland's dearest ally. So I think there's this kind of clear movement at this time towards not just simply let's not talk about American slavery, but we need to sort of emphasize America as a land of freedom and liberty, slavery and all, in order to gain American support for the cause of repeal. And I see this as kind of the germ of an Irish critique of abolitionism that viewed anti-slavery reform as a device of a distraction from the political welfare of the Irish people and from the cause of Irish sovereignty. Yet it might not have gained the currency it did if not for the devastating events that soon consumed Irish nationalist politics in the years ahead. Even before the fallout from O'Connell's pledge of Irish support to the British Empire had settled, reports began circulating in Ireland about a partial potato crop failure. Phytophthora infestans, the fungus responsible for the partial failure of 1845's potato crop, it returned in 1846 when the potato harvest was a mere 20% of its typical yield. The blight subsided in 1847, but emaciated Irish peasant farmers had been unable to plant a sufficient crop for that year. And in 1848, the blight returned to the utter devastation of farmers whose confidence in the potato had been temporarily restored. And as the fungus returned each year for the next half decade, potato harvest never exceeded 50% of pre-1845 levels. Now, in and of itself, the potato blight would have dealt a severe blow to the millions of Irish smallholders, cottiers, and laborers who depended largely or entirely on the potato for sustenance. But their misery was to be compounded by a poor relief system that was funded and overseen by penny-pinching landlords, by the belief among many evangelical British politicians that the potato blight was divinely ordained, and especially by a dogmatic adherence to laissez-faire economics by politicians in London who refused to intervene in any meaningful way. And so it was that a critical food shortage became a famine whose effects in terms of population decline due to death and outmigration are vividly illustrated on the map here. Now, almost immediately after word of the potato crop's failure reached the United States, Americans began to rally to send humanitarian relief to Ireland. American donations to Irish famine relief would then reignite this kind of years-long debate over whether or not Irish nationalists could accept aid from the slaveholding republic across the Atlantic. It's worth just briefly highlighting the scale of that assistance during the famine years. By January 1847, so barely a year and a half after the first partial failure of the potato crop, an Irish-American lawyer reported that some $808,000 had been contributed to famine relief by Irish Americans in New York City alone. The next month, in February of 1847, the Nation in Dublin, it reported this figure from New York City and highlighted that additional aid from Baltimore, Boston, Philadelphia brought the total donations from just those four cities to some $1.5 million. And then in the coming 4 to 5 months, between February and June of 1847, Boston's Famine Relief Association itself raised another $150,000 that it sent to Dublin. Equally as compelling, I think, is the diverse backgrounds of those who contributed to Irish famine relief. Of course, Irish Americans were among the most eager and among the most generous contributors relative to their socioeconomic standing. But United States senators agreed to donate $972 each, with representatives in the House chipping in another $349 each. Choctaw Indians in Arkansas raised $710 for famine relief, while enslaved African Americans on a plantation in Alabama pooled together some $50. Mill workers, miners, railroad workers gave what they could, even as wealthy industrialists like the textile magnate Amos Lawrence made sizable individual donations. So on the one hand, American support for Irish famine relief affirmed in the minds of young Irelanders the generous spirit and what they saw as the benevolence of Americans. But on the other hand, it led abolitionists in both Ireland and America to fret that Irish people would become blind to the moral contagion of American slavery. And those sort of diametrically opposed perspectives on American aid to Ireland during the famine now collided with a new twist in Irish nationalist politics in 1847. Now, by this point in time, O'Connell's health was in severe decline. He would perish in Rome shortly hereafter. Moreover, the Young Ireland faction of the repeal movement had embraced a more militant style of rhetoric, showed a signal to embrace more militant tactics than the Repeal Association's leadership had allowed for. And as a result, members of the Young Ireland faction broke from the loyal National Repeal Association and formed a new body, the Irish Confederation, in January of 1847. Now, unlike the Repeal Association, the Irish Confederation refused to reject violence as a means of pursuing Irish autonomy from Britain. And at the Irish Confederation's first meeting in January, which was held at the building you see here, the Rotunda building in Dublin, the question of how to fund this new organization came to the fore. And that was thanks largely to the agitation of the abolitionist James Houghton. Now, I mentioned earlier that Houghton had been instrumental in lobbying O'Connell to use the repeal platform to denounce American slavery and its defenders. But more than any other abolitionist in Ireland, Houghton was committed to the cause of Irish autonomy. He went so far as to join the Young Irelanders in breaking from the Repeal Association and forming the Irish Confederation. And in recognition of this, and perhaps in an effort to mend fences with other repealers, the Young Irelanders who comprised the Confederation's leadership made Houghton the treasurer of this new organization. And Houghton really wasted no time in impressing upon his younger colleagues the need to claim the moral high ground in their struggle for independence. He counseled them at their first meeting in January to, quote, indignantly refuse the bloodstained contributions of American enslavers. And in the coming months, Houghton authored a series of editorials in The Nation in which he disputed the notion put forth by prominent Young Irelanders that the direness of Ireland's situation necessitated the acceptance of aid from any and all sources. Now, as this is happening within the Irish Confederation in the first 3 to 4 months of 1847, Houghton's colleagues in the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society were engaged in their own sort of internal squabble over a nearly identical issue. In 1846, several Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society leaders had assumed key roles in the Central Relief Committee of the Society of Friends. And this was a Quaker philanthropical group that solicited and distributed funds for famine relief across the British Isles and North America, right? So it took the money in from those places and distributed it across Ireland. In March of 1847, the Relief Committee had a brief debate over whether or not to accept donations of £1,300 from Charleston, South Carolina, and £1,000 from Baltimore, Maryland. And while the committee decided to accept those donations from slave states, the decision was not without some controversy. You can read about it in the committee's transactions, which I've highlighted on the screen here. A co-founder of the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society, who also became a member of the Central Relief Committee, named Richard Allen. You see Allen much later in life in the photograph here. Allen dissented from the body's decision, and after it voted to accept these donations, he wrote a scathing letter to the National Anti-Slavery Standard in New York City, a prominent abolitionist newspaper. In this letter, Allen argued that by accepting aid from people who he believed to be have some connection to slavery, the committee members had become, as he put it, quote, allies of slave breeders and slave traders and accessories to the robbery, concubinage, and heathenism of slavery. He lays it on pretty thick in this letter. And similar sentiments were echoed in letters to the editors of American abolitionist newspapers from both abolitionists in Ireland, as well as a handful of their colleagues in the United States. Now, in and of itself, Allen and other abolitionists' ultimately futile opposition to the Central Relief Committee's acceptance of famine relief from slave states was really of little consequence. The Relief Committee's work received pretty scant attention in the Irish nationalist press, and it went virtually unnoticed from donors in the United States. But the following month in April, Allen and other Irish and American abolitionist calls to reject famine relief from slave states, they resurfaced within the much more publicized deliberations of the Irish Confederation and the newspapers that reported on them to Irish and Irish American readers. And once again, the man at the center of this controversy was James Haughton. Now, you'll recall that in spite of his deep reverence for O'Connell as a leading anti-slavery voice, Haughton had quit the Loyal National Repeal Association and joined the Young Ireland faction in the Irish Confederation. And as treasurer of that body, he had pleaded for its leadership to reject what he termed the quote-unquote blood-stained money of American enslavers and those who defended chattel slavery. And at an April 1847 meeting of the Confederation that took place here, this is the Music Hall on Abbey Street in Dublin, Haughton once again stated his case to the organization's leadership. He first observed that the Confederation could accomplish its aims only through what he called the pecuniary assistance of all classes of Irishmen. And so he urged those who supported the Confederation to give up expensive luxuries like liquor and tobacco. But at the same time, he pleaded for the Confederation not to let their, quote, hatred of man-stealing to be buried under the blood-stained dollars of slaveholders, end quote. And revealingly, Haughton pointed to the Central Relief Committee's acceptance of donations from Baltimore and Charleston as examples of what not to do. As he stated in this speech to the Irish Confederation, Relief Committee members who had voted to accept those donations had become, quote, alamonas to the women whippers and cradle plunderers of Baltimore and Charleston. Now, this was by no means a new argument. Throughout the 1840s, O'Connell had threatened to return donations to the repeal movement that had any sort of evident ties to enslavers or their defenders. And Haughton himself, of course, had made the same argument at a previous Irish Confederation meeting and in the pages of the Nation throughout the first half of the decade. But what followed from his plea on this April night was a virtual death knell for American and Irish abolitionist laborers in Ireland in the 1840s. Before Haughton could even finish his remarks, a man from the floor shouted, quote, in an assembly of Irishmen, that is not the way America should be spoken of, end quote. Another voice from the floor called out for and then received, quote, 3 cheers for American sympathy, end quote. And as an exasperated Haughton tried to regain control of the floor, he was outstaged by a voice from the crowd that called out, quote, repeal. We want no slave lecturing here. At this point, Haughton took his seat, and the Confederation Secretary, Thomas D'Arcy McGee, read an address to the Vice President of the United States, George Mifflin Dallas, who was also a leading figure in American famine relief efforts. The address, written on behalf of the Irish Confederation, disparaged the British Empire for allowing Ireland to, quote, depend on the voluntary contributions of a traduced rival, the United States, for its rescue. As Haughton no doubt shook his head in dismay, the address to Vice President Dallas was unanimously adopted by the Irish Confederation's Leadership Council, and soon after, Haughton resigned from the body. A year later, he reflected on these failed efforts to sever Ireland's connections to American slavery. And his conclusion was as follows. He wrote to an abolitionist colleague in America, quote, the mind of Ireland needs enlightenment on this question of freedom. And so I think, put in other words, Haughton recognized that the Young Ireland movement had flatly rejected the notion that the welfare of Irish people should be a concern secondary to or even on par with the fate of African-American slaves. And over the next decade and a half, that sentiment proved to be readily adaptable to Irish-American circumstances. The transformation of the Irish critique of abolitionism into an Irish-American critique of anti-slavery writ large was aided and abetted by many of the young islanders who fled in exile to the United States after the failed 1848 rebellion in Ireland. Among them, of course, were the men you see on the screen here: John Mitchell on the left, Thomas D'Arcy McGee in the center, and Thomas Francis Marr on the right, all of whom at one point in time in the 1850s owned or edited Irish American newspapers. And as the sectional crisis over slavery in their adopted country accelerated between 1848 and 1860, these exiled young Irelanders reminded the Irish American communities that read their newspapers or attended their speeches that anti-slavery agitation had splintered the repeal movement in Ireland, just as it now threatened to splinter their adopted country in the United States. And as the famine immigrants confronted exploitative working conditions, abysmal housing, and nativist bigotry, young Irelanders told them that abolitionists disregarded their suffering in America, much in the same way they had disregarded the suffering of famine victims in Ireland. And so through the outbreak of the Civil War, then, Irish American views on the debate over the future of American slavery were tinged by this transatlantic lens. Prior to the war, the upshot of this was that Irish Americans opposed all varieties of anti-slavery with near unanimity. However, that same transatlantic perspective eventually enabled a critical mass of Irish Americans to embrace emancipation as a means of restoring the American Union as a haven for immigrants and as an ally to the cause of Irish sovereignty. Now, I'd be happy to field questions in the Q&A if you have any about those kind of subsequent developments, but for now, I'd like to thank you all for your time and your attention, and to reiterate my thanks to Elizabeth for the opportunity to speak with you all tonight.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much for giving us that talk. You know, it strikes me, and obviously you didn't deal with the other half, you know, but this talk was very interesting, I think, for Irish America, because we often don't get that background, just how kind of pervasive the anti or the abolitionist movement was in Ireland, and how, you know, particularly it struck me when you're talking about Daniel O'Connell. I knew he had written that petition, you know, that comes over to Boston in the 1830s, and we've talked before in the museum in Albany about Frederick Douglass going to Ireland. But to think, if he was mirroring or talking about that and linking the causes so early with the repeal movement at those monster meetings, you know, this was then a topic of conversation in many Irish homes before the famine, and certainly, you know, before they come to America to fight in the Civil War. Do you think that there's something that changes that, you know, and again, I realize it's not fair to ask you what you didn't talk about, but
no, sure, I'd be happy to.
There's something, you know, that happens when they get to America, or how does Ireland continue to talk about slavery during the Civil War?
So I think what really changes is that it's the breakup of the United States because of the Civil War, all of a sudden now threatens both America's ability to act, as I said at the very end, as this kind of haven for immigrants, including but not limited to from Ireland, and threatens the constitutional safeguards afforded to immigrants. If the act of secession is fundamentally unconstitutional, then some Irish American leaders say, well, what's to stop, taking away religious liberties and freedoms, for instance, for Catholics in America, right? So that's something that's uniquely kind of affecting potentially Irish immigrants. And perhaps even more so, it's, well, how is America going to continue to act as a kind of bulwark against the expansion of British power in the Atlantic Ocean world, especially, and most directly as potential as an ally to Ireland in its continued efforts to achieve, you know, some type of sovereignty from Britain? And I think it's that rupture of the American Union that sort of ironically made Irish Americans, at least a good many of them, realize that, well, if the choice is between support for anti-slavery and support for the American Union, we're going to choose support for the American Union all the time. And if it requires adopting anti-slavery, then we'll do that as a kind of means to an end. And I think that's really what the second half of the book really tries to kind of map out, is that there are kind of continuously, continued renewed connections between the Irish in America and Ireland, right? There's this food shortage during the Civil War where Irish Americans raised funds to send back for famine relief. There's the rejuvenation of Irish nationalism on both sides of the Atlantic, and the prospect now of tens of thousands of militarily trained Irish Americans that might aid in the liberation of Ireland and use their military service in the Union Army to do so, right? And so with this kind of realization, suddenly it's maybe not becoming an abolitionist per se, but it's simply recognition that the Union is what's crucial here. The American kind of having a robust American nation is what's most pivotal. And if slavery is standing in the way of that, then we'll kind of do what we need to do to eliminate that part of the equation, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And then just to throw a fly in the ointment, will you talk a little bit, you mentioned him at the end there, about John Mitchell, for instance, who, of course, maybe it's because just geography, he goes down to the south and fights for the Confederacy, but how does his vision change, or did it change? Was he ever abolitionist while he was in Ireland and a young Ireland, or did he kind of not get involved in that rhetoric until he became American?
No, he's pretty consistently, both in Ireland and America, vehement opponent of
yeah.
not just abolitionism, but of kind of most types of social reform. Mitchell occupies a really prominent part in, I think it's chapter 4 of the book, because of course he infamously comes to America having escaped Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, in 1854, and in the first issue of his new newspaper, The Citizen, or one of the first issues, he responds to a letter from the Irish abolitionist James Houghton. Houghton is writing these young Ireland exiles throughout the early to mid 1850s saying, hey, now is your chance to kind of redeem yourself and throw your support behind the anti-slavery movement in America. And Mitchell writes back in this really vicious letter saying that not only will we not join the abolitionist cause, but Mitchell essentially says, I would like nothing more than a plantation stocked with enslaved African Americans in Alabama. He uses much harsher language than that. And so a lot of historians have looked at that as a kind of exhibit A for Irish American, not only opposition to the anti-slavery movement, but what many have posited is actually outright endorsement of chattel slavery itself, which I think is not the case. What I kind of highlight in the book is that a number of young Irelanders, both those who are back in Ireland, some in Australia, and especially those in the United States, they do everything they can to disassociate themselves from Mitchell after he writes that letter. And it brings about a kind of, small but growing chorus of Irish immigrants that are saying, well, we don't like the abolitionist movement because we see it as threatening to break apart our adopted country. But that doesn't mean we're in favor of chattel slavery itself, right? They in their minds think they can kind of disentangle those two things from each other. The course of the sectional conflict shows them that they can't, that essentially it is a question of one or the other. But in that moment when Mitchell comes and kind of, really throws in his lot with enslavers in 1854, there's a large body of Irish Americans and prominent Irish Americans that say, no, we aren't abolitionists, but we're also not going to defend slavery here like Mitchell's doing. I think, in the book, I say that, his decision to move to Tennessee is in some ways out of necessity. He I think, sees the subscription list for the Citizen drop precipitously after that letter to Houghton, and essentially realizes that to hold these views in an increasingly anti-slavery North is going to kind of cast him as a pariah, basically, and lessen his clout to continue to pursue Irish nationalist aims.
It's fascinating, the interplay between religion and politics and the need for political kind of acumen. And then you kind of alluded to it too in your introduction, the whiteness study stuff, which I've never. Some of the books are better, I think, argued than others. The Wages of Whiteness, I thought, was a particularly good one, as opposed to maybe How the Irish Became White was a little bit broad strokes, But maybe there is something in that in order to get ahead, in a country where the system was already quite racist, there's an element of not just Irish, but later on Jewish immigrants and Italian immigrants subscribing. Yeah.
No, I think, and you can see that kind of as you described there, past the end of slavery, right, in 1865. This isn't to say that Irish immigrants or latter immigrants like Jews, Italians, Poles, Slovenes, Slovaks, etc., right? They don't become anti-racist, as we would say today, right? They might acknowledge that the end of slavery is a good thing for the nation, for their prospects as workers, perhaps, but by no means does that mean that they are kind of, racial egalitarians. And in fact, it's part of what I try to show in the book is that there's a pretty broad range of opinion about, well, if you agree to the necessity of emancipation, how far are you then willing to go to bring it about, and then to pursue beyond just the basic condition of freedom, the elevation of the Southern Black population in the aftermath of slavery.
And I mean, we see Abraham Lincoln and other people struggle with this. Like nobody particularly wants social equality, for instance, so like there's yeah. Does anyone online, I'm just going to ask, we have a question here. That's great. Lawrence asked, did any American political parties, particularly the Democrats, take any official positions on the Irish struggle against British rule?
Good question. And yes, this is moments in the mid to late 1840s, early 1850s, where you have actually both the Whigs and the Democrats in some ways trying to kind of outdo each other to at least outwardly show that they are sympathetic to the cause of Irish nationalism. There's a couple of accounts. I'm trying to think of there's a Whig candidate whose name is escaping me, but he kind of tries to adopt an Irish brogue on the campaign trail and kind of gets mocked for it in the Irish American press, but he's doing so to try to win over Irish votes. And one way to try to win over Irish votes in the famine period especially is to kind of bash the British Empire. In Congress, there's talk in Congress. John Calhoun, the kind of famous pro-slavery South Carolinian politician, gives a speech in the mid 1840s during the famine where he's talks about the degraded status in which the British keep Irish people. I think really interestingly, there's this moment, I think it's in 1846, where there's actually a resolution introduced into Congress by representatives from Alabama, a Democratic representative from Alabama, to try to say that we should try to add Ireland as a state of the Union, essentially. It goes nowhere, right? But it's fascinating to me that you have a Democratic politician from Alabama raising this. I think probably to score political points.
Yeah,
it's always hard to tell how genuine, whether it's Whig or Democrat, how genuine those sympathies are to the cause of Irish, sovereignty. But it's out there, right? And if you're, an Irish American newspaper editor, an exiled young Ireland nationalist, this is only to your benefit, right? It helps you kind of, try to lobby, politicians to do something more, tangible, concrete, in support of that cause.
Terry Galway says too, I can't remember who it was, but apparently, somebody might have been De Valera or somebody said that Tammany Hall later on, in the early 20th century or the late 19th century had done so much, in terms of financial aid and things, and that really without them, we wouldn't have an independent Ireland. And he said, it's kind of maybe a throwaway statement, and it might mean more individual Irish Americans than actually like Tammany Hall or the Democratic Party machine, whatever it is. But he says there are no ledgers, to back that up, but he'd like to look at them. So, it's interesting that is a kind of at least a talking point for certain politicians from about the mid 19th century on.
In the epilogue to the book, I kind of provide a much longer history and follow it right through the 1920s, 1930s to look at, well, the Union's restored. Irish Americans have kind of thrown in their lot with the Union and embraced emancipation to do so, because they think that doing so will allow them to advance the cause of Irish freedom. So what happens with that? And I show and draw upon the research of a number of folks, David Brundage's book on Irish nationalism in America, Eli Janis's book about the Land League, that throughout the late 19th, early 20th century, Irish Americans provide massive amounts of funding to Irish nationalist organizations on both sides of the Atlantic. And they're instrumental in plotting and planning for the 1916, Easter Rising, in the figure of John Devoy. So I think there's in some ways what they had expected during the Civil War, right? That if we help to restore the Union, even if it means having to embrace emancipation, this will ultimately aid the cause of Irish freedom. It certainly takes a while, but Irish Americans go a long way towards advancing that. And I think at some key moments, they get rhetorical support from, American politicians, right? Non-Irish politicians in America that helps to kind of set that forward.
Let me just check YouTube, but if there are any more questions, please do ask. Otherwise, on this rainy and humid night, that was amazing. So the book is available, of course, online, on Amazon, but through Fordham Press and any of the local bookstores. I think, Ian, that will be brilliant. Your new work, you said, is going to be on the gin. Did you say gin things and all that? Yeah.
Yeah, so not much to do with Ireland or America, but something of a pet project of mine. I live in the town where Eli Whitney was born, the inventor of the cotton gin. And long story short, came to understand that the sort of story we have about Eli Whitney as the inventor of the cotton gin is flawed and very incomplete that there's a long line of New Englanders that are involved in various types of aspects of gin manufacturing that help to advance the spread of cotton, not only in America but also globally. So it's kind of becoming a more global project, looking at how these kind of gin makers in New England are, contributing to the spread of cotton and slavery in the South, to the expansion of British power in India during the 1850s and 1860s. So it's in its kind of infancy, but that's where my research is going now.
Well, that whole textile, thing is so interesting still today when you think about, conditions and stuff in Bangladesh and other countries, and that, they're taking the heat for the environmental consequences. So that obviously was happening here 150 years ago. It's amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, that's it'll be a long ways off towards another book, but that's where I'm looking now.
Okay, good. Oh, another comment here. Title of the book, Jack, it's called Embracing Emancipation. A transatlantic history of Irish American slavery and the American Union between 1840 and 1865. For Jack, probably the museum will order a couple of copies up in Albany. They have relationships with some of the publishers. We're still working on that here in the city, but so if we can't get it for you, Jack, into the museum shop, you can just buy it online. That's fine. But look, thank you very much, everyone. Apologies for the blocked nose. I caught a cold last week, and it's not COVID, but it's hard to shift. So thank you, everyone, and we'll have you back, I think, Ian, to give us another talk in the future. And enjoy Boston.
Thanks so much, Liz.
Great, thanks. Take care. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.